Hey everyone, it's Brian. Just a quick show note before we begin today. When we were recording this season 3, we were still wrestling with what to call the small, formative communities we often refer to that are helpful and even necessary in our journey into deep discipleship. We've referred to them as immersive communities of formation, or ICFs, and 5-element communities. Down the road a bit, around episode 50, we finally just decided to call them greenhouses. That's the term that stuck, and if you go to our website, you'll find lots of information on greenhouses. So as you're listening today, you may hear some of those old terms, such as ICF and 5-element community. If you wouldn't mind, just mentally substitute the term greenhouse when you hear those older terms, and you'll be all set. Greenhouses are also covered in full in the Soil and Roots book, and you can find more information about that on the site or on Amazon. Thanks so much, and enjoy the episode. Hey there, and welcome to the Soil and Roots podcast, digging beneath the surface to uncover the hidden ideas that form us in the church and our culture. I'm Brian Fisher. This is episode 44, Danger, Will Robinson. When I was in my 20s, I was approached by an elder of our large, growing, non-denominational Bible church to help him start a new company that was being funded by an angel investor. I was thrilled, excited to be recognized by a leader in our mega church as a potential business executive, and so I agreed to come work for him as the number 2 person in this new organization. And the first few years were amazing, a really wonderful adventure. I discovered I had a knack for business, and the elder who recruited me poured himself into me, my professional development, as my new boss. Over time, we became very close. I began to think of him as a father-type figure, and he told me more than once that he thought of me like a son. He mentored me, guided me, trained me to become an effective and thoughtful executive, and the company took off. In just a few short years, we had grown into a scrappy and respected firm, and were bringing in new business and new staff at a rapid pace. A few years in, we negotiated a deal to buy the company from the original angel investor. So we formed a coalition of staff and some other folks and began working on the transaction. It was an enormous amount of effort, about a year's worth of time, but all of the blood and sweat and tears paid off. One day, we went from being employees to partners, now the owners of a young and vibrant company with a bright future. The day after the buyout closed, my boss called me into his office. I was expecting him to join the rest of us in celebrating the buyout and planning for the future, but instead he sat me down and he spent the next hour and a half berating and criticizing me and questioning my character. He had written down a list of 15 to 20 things about me that he found deeply concerning, and he went through the list one by one, accusing me of various wrongdoings, some of which suggested I was a conniving and rather underhanded person. Well, I was stunned, I was heartbroken, I was deeply confused. He had never given me a negative performance review, and he had never ever spoken to me this way before. I was baffled why he would choose the day after our greatest corporate success to basically take me to the woodshed. And candidly, 4 or 5 of the things of which he accused me had some truth to them. There were some things I had done or said that should have been corrected. There were some things in my work life I certainly could improve. But the rest of his list was a mystery to me, and some of his accusations were downright bizarre, including some things that didn't even involve work. But being a young man eager to please his mentor, I took some time to think through every one of the accusations, and I came back to him a few days later, and I apologized for everything, things I had and hadn't done, and asked him to work with me so that I can improve. I desperately wanted his approval and was mortified that I had failed him so deeply, especially during a time that should have been really joyful. However, the next few years brought more tension, more accusations, and a general sense of mistrust. Whereas in the first few years it seemed I could do no wrong, now all of a sudden I could do no right. And I began to slowly accept the inevitable. My relationship with my mentor, an elder in our church, a close fatherly friend, was not going to recover. And I couldn't even put my finger on a good reason why. Exhausted, disillusioned, bewildered, we negotiated my departure while barely escaping a legal battle. And in the process, my wife and I lost several good friends, and our reputation at church was damaged. We were now outsiders in more ways than one, and in an act of mercy, God eventually moved us from the area. It would take me several more years to see the situation clearly and to accept what had really happened. My mentor had used me to get what he wanted, control of the company. And then he needed to get rid of me. because in his mind I now posed a threat to his power. Because he lacked the courage and the evidence to just fire me, he instead decided it was to be a death by 1,000 cuts. He would just make me miserable and make me question myself so much I would eventually leave. And I did. Years later, I would learn there are clinical terms for these types of tactics. In our first few years together, his constant praise, his telling me I was like a son to him, his regular affirmation and encouragement is what psychologists call love bombing. Now, once we bought the company, he engaged in what's known as gaslighting, which is making someone question reality by constantly switching the narrative, making misleading accusations, bending the truth, leaving the victim bewildered and confused. The term comes from the 1944 movie Gaslight, in which a husband makes his wife go insane by manipulating her. I finally concluded that, in fact, I had been targeted, groomed, used, and then discarded by a narcissist. I wish I could tell you this was the only time I had experienced the impact of narcissism. However, I've worked for more than one narcissist, worked with several of them, and unfortunately have hired my fair share of them over my career. And my inability to properly diagnose and handle narcissists has caused me and my family substantial professional, reputational, and personal harm. Hopefully by now I've become more discerning. Hopefully. By the way, every narcissistic boss, coworker, or employee with whom I've engaged has claimed to be a committed Christian. And so we come to our last topic regarding our third element of formation this season, community, with a note of caution. If there's one thing that will destroy your community from the inside out, it's a narcissist. And so learning to recognize them and how to relate to them is essential as we seek to build and foster healthy ICFs. Well, let's start by defining who we're talking about. According to counselor, pastor, and professor Chuck DeGroat, the word narcissist is derived from a Greek word meaning numb. It refers to, quote, someone who has been robbed of a God-given desire to live for and love others. Instead, he is turned inward and enamored by his own image. A narcissist, in other words, is a self-worshipper, numb to his or her deepest desire to love and be loved by God, end quote. Clinical psychologist Dr. Jim Wilder notes, quote, narcissists can affirm whatever makes them look good. With their brains in non-relational mode, narcissists do not share the pain others feel and so have no guilt and will justify whatever it takes to make others lose. Narcissists punish rather than love those who do not treat the narcissist right, end quote. We all struggle with narcissistic moments, of course, when we lack empathy or when we struggle with insecurity, but a diagnosable narcissist is someone who's pathologically unable to empathize and will work towards his or her own interests, regardless of who's wounded in the process. They're apparently incapable of genuine repentance because repentance requires us to acknowledge, embrace, and accept our own wrongdoings and the impact that it has on others. Narcissists can be extraordinarily devious, yet never see it in themselves. Steve Jobs was famous for creating his own perspective of reality. They called it his reality distortion field. This is the way of a narcissist. She creates her own version of reality, and anyone who doesn't accept that version is eventually punished. There are various types of narcissists, and we won't cover them all today, but there's the grandiose type, which is what many people think of when they picture a narcissist. They're loud, brash, condescending, and give the appearance of substantial confidence, despite the fact they're actually deeply insecure. If you throw a dart at a wall filled with pictures of national politicians and Hollywood actors, and there's a good chance you'll hit a grandiose narcissist. The covert narcissist is much trickier to identify. Debbie Mirza writes, quote, covert narcissists will often have careers that are impressive. They can be pastors, spiritual leaders, therapists, and heads of nonprofit organizations. They can be politicians who are charming, look you right in the eye, and really seem to care. Coverts do have a grandiose sense of self. They're preoccupied with fantasies of power and require excessive admiration, but they hide these attributes so people will like and trust them. They know if they're obvious about their self-absorbed traits, people won't like them. They believe they're special and entitled, but they know it would turn people off to let that be known. They know they must appear humble to be liked and revered. They know how to play people, how to charm them. They are master manipulators. They don't have empathy, but have learned to act empathetically. They have people around them who adore them, respect them, see them as special and almost perfect, and in some cases seem to worship them. End quote. Most of the narcissists I've known and worked with are covert. They can be extremely hard to identify, and they tend to be very well liked and popular. They may lie dormant for months or even years, only to begin their punishment when it's safe and advantageous for them. And when they do, their victims are usually the ones who look like they're nuts. Now, narcissists use all sorts of techniques to ingratiate themselves with whomever they've targeted. We've already talked about love bombing. That's when they use compliments, encouragement, affirmation to cultivate trust. Narcissists are deeply insecure people, so they will often love bomb someone who is legitimately confident, only to turn on them when the object of their affection does something to disappoint the narcissist. When they're preparing to punish someone, they'll sometimes army build. They'll gather people around them who are easily manipulated into whatever they're planning. Followers of narcissists are, believe it or not, called flying monkeys, which is a reference to the Wicked Witch's minions in The Wizard of Oz. Narcissists will triangulate. They'll project on their victims. They'll accuse you of things of which they are guilty. They're amazingly effective at playing the victims themselves. And then there's the gaslighting. I worked for several years with one narcissist, and as I began to catch on to his disorder, could sense when he was about to gaslight me. At one point, we were moving some offices and people around due to some expansion, and knowing he was so deeply insecure, I asked him several times where he wanted his office, and he repeatedly said he didn't care. But sure enough, once the new office layout was complete, he complained to other staff that I had not given him an office that reflected his importance and value to the organization, as if our initial conversations had never happened. Now, if you've ever dealt with a narcissist and been aware of it, this is all familiar territory to you. And chances are, if you've ever been in a church, you've come across some narcissists. In fact, many narcissists target Christian communities because of the somewhat inherent trusting nature of many Christians. They feed off of what's known as narcissistic supply or narcissistic energy, such as constant attention, a need to be needed, regular affirmation, the availability to control others, frequent praise, and being in a place where they can accumulate power. For better or for worse, many Christian communities and organizations have these energy sources readily available. And narcissism certainly isn't constrained to lay people. According to Jim Wilder, a 2015 study estimated that between 96,000 and 112,000 churches in the USA currently have a narcissistic pastor. Virtually all Christians will experience a narcissistic pastor in their lifetime. These extraordinarily high levels can only be explained if churches actively seek, support, sustain, promote, and propagate narcissistic leaders. He goes on, to a very significant extent, Christian churches are unable to recognize personality disorders and may even find these disorders desirable in leaders. If, as one study suggests, 30 to 90% of churches in the West are run by narcissists, we should not be surprised that these churches cannot correct the problem. End quote. Now, having spent about half of my career in parachurch Christian ministry, I've finally begun to learn to spot narcissistic traits in Christian leaders. Certainly took me long enough. Many of these leaders are exceptionally careful about their reputations, but a careless word here or there will eventually reveal their hearts. A few years ago, I was having lunch with a pastor of a large Christian organization, and his highly controlling nature suggested some deep insecurities, if not narcissistic traits. Wondering just how deep the insecurities ran, I basically tested him. I said, "I've gotten to know several of your key staff. They're really incredible, and they seem really loyal to you." Without carefully thinking through his reply, he said, "Well, that's good, and if you hear anything different, you just let me know." A narcissistic leader usually demands personal loyalty, whether or not it's warranted. Part of our hesitancy in dealing with narcissism is just having the courage to recognize it and call it for what it is. It's a pathological, predatory disorder. For some reason, some of us desperately want to think that everyone who calls themselves a Christian really wants to be like Jesus, really has our best interest at heart, and must be a person of great character if they show up to church and raise their hands in worship and seem really nice. In his book, Toughest People to Love, Chuck DeGroat identifies 3 types of fools outlined in the Bible: the simple fool, the self-consumed fool, and the sinister fool. The simple fool is just ignorant of themselves and others. They aren't sure how to grow in wisdom. They may not be particularly socially conscious or empathetic, but it isn't because they're selfish or narcissistic. They just need someone to guide them. Then there's the self-consumed fool. This is someone who manipulates and uses people to serve their interests. The self-consumed fool may well be a narcissist. They may be aware of how they're treating people, but they just don't care. They have very little insight into their own hearts because of their deep insecurities, and they can be extremely difficult to love. Then there's the sinister fool. The Grote writes about an experience he had with this type of fool. Quote, "In my early years as a therapist, I encountered a man whose Christian reputation seemed impeccable, but who scared the daylights out of me. He seemed to prey on everyone's insecurities. He'd quote the Bible with razor-sharp acuity, yet twist its message to undermine and humiliate. After a session in which I confronted a particularly aggressive outburst from him, he emailed me with some of the most rationally clear but relationally twisted and condescending words I'd ever heard." End quote. Obviously, this self-professed Christian was a narcissist, and a particularly dangerous and evil one at that. There are some parallels between the three types of fools here and the three categories of people we talked about all the way back in episode 9. I don't expect you to remember them, but they are the garden variety sinner, wicked people, and evil people. So a simple fool may just be a garden variety sinner who lacks some common sense and emotional sensitivity. They may hurt and offend some people, but not because they're trying to. They just need to be gently coached. The wicked person from episode 9 bears a whole lot of resemblance to the self-consumed fool. If you cross them or become a threat to their reputation, they may make your life miserable and work to ruin you. The evil person looks a whole lot like the sinister fool. They take pleasure in harming and wounding others and specifically look for opportunities to do so. They're energized by destroying others and have a profound addiction to power. For my part, I've been the simple fool at times, and I've certainly thought about acting like a wicked person on some occasions, and I have worked closely with and been in relationships with both self-consumed and sinister fools. One of the friendliest, most engaging, most energetic, and popular people I've ever known turned out to be a self-consumed, if not sinister, fool. Profoundly addicted to power and praise, deeply controlling, highly manipulative, I naively invited him into my world and then realized too late that he was systematically dismantling it. And he was successful. And the entire time, he was participating in Bible studies and prayer meetings and encouraging and affirming those around him. To the untrained eye, he looked every part the loving Christian leader. We find narcissists throughout the Bible. In the Old Testament, there's Jezebel, a powerful example of a sinister narcissist. Her husband wasn't exactly a saint either, but Jezebel took pleasure in manipulating and destroying people. Then there's Nabal, who was Abigail's husband before David came along. His name actually means fool. We find his story in 1 Samuel 25. Several kings and pharaohs were narcissists, people like Saul, Nebuchadnezzar. The Pharaoh in Exodus is considered one of the most evil, narcissistic men in the entire Old Testament. Moses had quite a tumultuous time dealing with him. The case has been made that many of the Pharisees and religious leaders during Jesus' life on earth were, in fact, narcissists, men who were hungry for power, unwilling to repent, willing to destroy lives in order to maintain their control and authority. These would be both self-consumed and sinister narcissists. And though the command to quote-unquote love our neighbor frequently gets oversimplified in the church today, we see that Jesus dealt with these three types of people very differently. To the garden variety sinner, he often extended extraordinary mercy and kindness. To the wicked person, he was shrewd, coy, sometimes evasive. To the sinister person, Jesus was sometimes downright blunt, harsh. He used them as object lessons in public to show other people who to avoid and ignore. The way Jesus handled different people is often lost in today's church, where we hear all about the fruits of the Spirit with some regularity, but we somehow ignore passages in Proverbs, the Gospels, and the Epistles that encourage us to be wise, to protect our hearts, and to even avoid some types of people because of their wickedness. Proverbs 23 says, "Do not eat the bread of a selfish man or desire his delicacies, for as he thinks within himself, so he is. He says to you, eat and drink, but his heart is not with you. You will vomit up the morsel you have eaten and waste your compliments." Seems like loving our neighbor may involve some discernment, some nuance, some shrewd thinking, and careful relationship skills. Which brings us to a pivotal question. If every single human being is an image bearer of God, who therefore deserves being treated as such, how do we handle a narcissist who is part of our community, our family, our ICF? If you've ever dealt with, or lived with, or worked with, or been in a relationship with, or even married to a narcissist, you firsthand know the pain, the heartache, and the misery that comes along with it. To be uncomfortably candid, I've often questioned whether a narcissist can actually be redeemed. Though the modern church is apparently highly populated with narcissists, if one of their primary characteristics is the inability to repent, how can they possibly be a Christian? Can a predatory person who is unable to experience genuine empathy become a person of empathy? Well, I've not personally experienced it, but the answer is yes. Jim Wilder writes, "Transformation is never as clear as when a predator becomes a protector or an enemy becomes a friend. Many saints began life as narcissistic sociopaths. These individuals were deadly or pleasure-seeking, self-justified, hardened. St. Paul, St. Francis, St. Augustine, St. Ignatius of Loyola were all harmful individuals before they were transformed. The popular song Amazing Grace was written by a sociopathic slave trader. John Newton was responsible for the torment, devastation, and deaths of many slaves and families." End quote. Obviously, not every predatory personality does or will change. Most of the narcissists we noted in the Bible died as self-consumed and sinister narcissists. Still, if we haven't already, all of us will be in a relationship with a narcissist at some point, and that point may be in our ICFs. So how do we relate to them with biblical wisdom and still cultivate a healthy, formative community? Well, before we tackle that, I should note that virtually all of the reading and studying I've done on narcissism strongly suggests that the only way to deal with a narcissist is to stop dealing with them, to leave the relationship. And by the way, there are times when that is completely appropriate and necessary. If we start quoting Bible verses about turning the other cheek or suffering for the kingdom without considering other passages about relational maturity, shrewdness, protecting ourselves, our hearts, and our loved ones, we're not exercising genuine biblical wisdom. But in the case where prayer and counsel suggest we should be in a relationship with a narcissist, how might we love them? Well, the first step is to recognize them. Any of the resources I've cited in this episode provide great insight into how to spot narcissistic tendencies. You'll find them at soulandroots.org. Just go to the blog entry for this episode, and then you can check them out in the footnotes. In general, though, if you find yourself walking away from conversations with someone, wondering if you've gone crazy, or asking why the person keeps questioning your motives, or why the conversation always seems to center around them and without any regard to you, you're probably in a relationship with a narcissist. Now, covert narcissists are much harder to spot, but if you spend enough time with one and know the signs, you'll pick up on them. Now, second, in those very few resources I've explored that don't automatically suggest leaving the narcissist, they agree on one thing. Confronting a narcissist directly is a non-starter. In fact, it's unwise. Psychologist Mark Ettensohn writes, "When you attempt to change someone's negative behavior by treating them negatively, you only escalate an already bad situation. This is especially true when it comes to narcissism, because the person often feels that he or she has done nothing wrong in the first place. Your negative reaction actually reinforces the narcissist narrative of being a victim." End quote. One-on-one conversations with narcissists about their behavior are almost wholly ineffective. Coverts will listen carefully to your comments and act empathetically, but they'll eventually make your concerns about you. Dr. Wilder notes that even one-on-one engagement with trained professionals typically doesn't work. Quote, "Professional counselors achieve limited to no success with narcissists. Counseling schools often tell students not even to accept them as clients. I've attempted to have direct conversations with narcissists, and I have a 0% success rate. I've had friends with narcissistic spouses or relatives make the same mistake. Attempting to intellectually or emotionally reason with a narcissist is a waste of time and typically means you're damaging yourself. I spent several years trying to win over a narcissist I worked with, only to eventually realize my efforts at being vulnerable, forthright, emotional, transparent were only giving him ammunition, narcissistic supply, and power. In that case, I was the fool. I thought we were working towards reconciliation, but reconciliation had nothing to do with it. This is why reading how Jesus dealt with narcissists is so important. He gave very little of himself to them, even as he asked his Father to forgive them. Relating one-on-one with a narcissist involves prayer, some real wisdom, shrewdness, and careful thinking, and attempting to help a narcissist see his or her deep insecurities and how it impacts others in direct conversation is generally a very bad idea. Okay, so once we learn to recognize narcissistic traits, and once we accept that a one-on-one approach is probably a recipe for disaster, how do we go about loving them? Well, prayer is obviously a really good idea. prayer that God would supernaturally convert their hearts from being self-consumed to being consumed with God and the well-being of others. That was certainly the case with the Apostle Paul. Augustine apparently heard a child's voice telling him to read the scriptures, and that led to the softening of his heart. John Newton's heart was changed through a near-death experience. Sometimes prayer is the best or even only way we can love our narcissistic neighbor. In addition to prayer, one recommendation made by these very few Christian psychologists, neuroscientists, and counselors involves the power of community. Remember, neuroscientist Dr. Kurt Thompson said, quote, "Every baby comes into the world looking for someone who is looking for us. To have a conscious, embodied awareness of being known by God is a necessary feature of the life of loving God. And our awareness of being known by God is measured by the degree to which we are known by each other." End quote. There's a lot packed into his comment, how it relates to narcissism. Is narcissism genetic? Can we be predisposed to self-absorption and the inability to genuinely empathize? Or is narcissism more influenced by our early childhood story? If we come into this world desiring to be known by someone, but we're emotionally or physically or spiritually abandoned or even abused by those who are supposed to seek our goodness, is narcissism a deeply rooted defense mechanism against further harm? Remember, Chuck DeGroat defines a narcissist as someone who has been robbed of a God-given desire to live and love others. Well, robbed by whom? In any event, what we're concluding here is that the way to potentially transform the heart of a narcissist is similar to what we've been proposing and defending all season long on Soil and Roots, that our hearts are changed in a formative community, that our heart's desires, ideas, passions are not only or maybe even primarily changed through instruction or information, but through relationship in community. If a narcissist is a person whose heart wasn't initially formed to seek the goodness of others because they themselves didn't have a healthy attachment to caregivers, can their heart be changed by being in a community of people who have healthy attachment? If a narcissist is a delusional, lost person who can't even accept reality for what it is, can they be changed by being a part of a trained community who relates to her in the real world? In his book, The Pandora Problem, Dr. Wilder provides insight into how properly trained groups can gradually show, not tell, a narcissist what living with empathy looks like, how being confessional, dealing with shame properly can be lived out, how we can be safe in a community and still seek the goodness of others. He writes, "When a group begins to exchange healthy shame messages, correct self-justification, and love their enemies, isolated narcissists will learn a better way, or they'll leave." End quote. In other words, a healthy community helps to form a narcissist with loving, strong, life-giving relationships. The experience of being in a healthy community may well help the narcissist's heart to soften as he becomes accustomed to proper transparency and identity confession. Or it may not. Dr. Wilder calls these types of groups Hesed groups, which is the Hebrew word for loving kindness or love of neighbor. Kurt Thompson endorses a very similar idea, and he calls them confessional communities. Both insist that narcissism can only be dealt with in groups specifically trained and molded in a strong identity of loving kindness. It isn't that a narcissist should be told who to be and what to do. They need to be shown who to be over time with consistency in a secure environment. Both authors give substantial guidance on how to do that in their books and their resources. Overall, this is a primary theme of Soil and Roots, that all of our hearts, narcissistic or not, are formed primarily in a community that embodies certain characteristics, that our desires, our ideas, our passions are normally formed through our relationships, with God first, though understanding He often relates to us through other people. That's why the combination of time, habit, community, intimacy, instruction are so important. Our hearts desperately need primary communities who seek our goodness, who embody loving kindness, who consistently and patiently relate to us the way God does. It's not enough to be told. Our hearts need to experience it. Tough episode today, especially if you have been or are in a relationship with a narcissist. It's hard for some Christians to accept that there are people in our churches and our communities who may legitimately be seeking to kill us, our reputations, our careers, our identity, our sanity. That there are people professing Christ who are actually unable to repent, unable to feel empathy, and will do whatever it takes to preserve their own delusions at any cost and not even feel a twinge of guilt about it. Oftentimes we don't see narcissism because we don't want to see it. We all struggle with it to some degree, but we recognize that for others, it's who they are. In a very real sense, a narcissist who has targeted you is your enemy, even if they're sitting in church. Yet Jesus calls us to love our enemies. Sometimes we love a narcissist best by never speaking to them again. Sometimes we love a narcissist by distancing the relationship and being very careful and coy with what we say. And perhaps some of us may love a narcissist by being in a community with them, carefully, wisely showing them what empathy, confession, healthy shame, acceptance really looks like, that she experiences perhaps what she never had. A group of people truly, genuinely looking for her. Dealing with a narcissist is not for the faint of heart and involves substantial prayer, work, and training, and the outcomes may be mixed. But loving someone doesn't guarantee an outcome, so let's be open to loving our neighbor, perhaps even the narcissist. Hey, thanks for listening. If you like the podcast, share the podcast and give it a good rating. And don't forget, all of the episodes are transcribed on the blog, so you can read them at your leisure and share them with your friends. For more information, you can check out soilandroots.org and email me at fish@soilandroots.org. And Kyle and I will see you next time in the greenhouse.